This is A Rude Awakening. I'm Sabrina Jacobs. On today's show, an update on the feral cows roaming the Gila wilderness of New Mexico. I speak to Todd Schulke of Center for Biological Diversity. We'll switch gears and speak to Liberty University's Dr. Leslie Joseph about the effects of war on the environment. And close it out with friend of the show, Media Matters for America, Evlondo Cooper, on the latest numbers behind the lack of environmental justice coverage in corporate media. But first, the news.
I'm Max Pringle with these headlines. Embattled Maine Senate hopeful Graham Plattner is hosting his first major campaign event since media reports surfaced that he previously exchanged sexually explicit text messages with several women while he was married. Plattner is an oyster farmer and progressive activist. He's key to the Democrats' hopes to take back the U.S. Senate this year, as the party needs him to defeat longtime Republican Senator Susan Collins. Plattner is scheduled to appear in Bar Harbor today with progressive Bay Area Congressman Ro Khanna and a pair of Democratic Maine candidates. It's billed as a Get Out the Vote Day rally. Controversy has swirled around Plattner's campaign. A New York Times report detailed accusations from women who claimed Plattner exhibited unsettling and toxic behavior during their past relationships, including physical intimidation, though his campaign strongly denies the allegations of physical abuse. Southern Baptists will gather for their annual meeting on Tuesday, and for the fourth year in a row, they'll debate whether to formally ban churches with a woman in any role resembling that of pastor. One thing they're unlikely to debate is any noticeable change in the politics of many Southern Baptists. They form the vanguard of the broader white conservative evangelical support for President Trump. More than 11,000 church representatives have pre-registered for the two-day meeting in Orlando, Florida. The Southern Baptist Convention's membership has declined to its lowest since 1973, but it remains influential as the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. The Senate has passed a $70 billion immigration enforcement funding bill. It passed without limits Democrats wanted to a $1.8 billion fund to pay Trump allies who say they've been politically persecuted. Democrats introduced several amendments meant to block passage of the bill during the debate. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer called on Republicans to reject what he called a slush fund for Trump's political cronies.
Republican senators need to stop playing dumb. They need to listen to the truth and stop trusting these fools like Todd Blanche, who lies to the American people repeatedly.
Democrats also wanted reforms to immigration and customs enforcement included in any bill to fund the agency after ICE officers shot and killed two Minneapolis activists earlier this year at protests against immigration crackdowns there. Ohio Senator Bernie Moreno said the funding is needed to secure the country's borders.
They are going to play so many games over the next 8, 9, 10 hours. Bring it on. Because what we will do today is we will make certain that communities are safe in this country.
Republicans passed the bill on a reconciliation vote. That means it didn't need the 60 votes usually needed to pass tax and spending bills and could pass on a simple majority. The Senate has blocked a procedural vote on extending a key surveillance program used by U.S. intelligence agencies. The vote complicates efforts to renew the program before it expires June 12th. 6 Republicans joined nearly all Democrats in opposing the measure, which would have set up a final vote next week. The setback comes as lawmakers in both parties raise concerns about President Trump's selection of housing finance regulator Bill Pulte to serve as Director of National Intelligence without any prior experience in intelligence. Republican leaders can bring the legislation back next week ahead of the deadline. U.S. employers added 172,000 jobs in May as the labor market continued to show resilience in the face of rising costs from the Iran war. The Labor Department reported today that job growth was down slightly last month from a revised 179,000 in April. The unemployment rate stayed at a low 4.3%. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called for an in-person meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. In an open letter, Zelensky said the two countries can't wait for the U.S. to mediate while it focuses on the war with Iran. More from William Denslow.
Ukraine's foreign minister has called the open letter a serious and meaningful proposal to end the war. Zelensky's called for direct engagement between Ukraine and Russia and for a full ceasefire to be in effect throughout any negotiations. Ukraine's president also took a swipe at Vladimir Putin, saying that after 26 years in power, it was starting to take its toll. Russian officials confirmed the letter has been received and that the president would be briefed. As with previous invitations for talks, the Kremlin says that Zelensky is welcome for a meeting if he comes to Moscow.
That's William Denslow. The United States has frozen assets belonging to Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel and his family. It's the Trump administration's latest attempt to ramp up the pressure on the Cuban government. More from Ira Spitzer.
According to a filing on the Treasury Department's website, the U.S. has imposed personal sanctions on Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel, along with his wife and others. The sanctions are the latest move in a broader escalation that has been building for months. Back in May, President Trump signed an executive order significantly expanding the U.S. sanctions framework on Cuba, putting foreign companies and banks that do business with the island at risk. Speaking at the White House Thursday, Trump said the U.S. had some, quote, very good plans for Cuba, and that Washington had to get rid of the government there, and noted that they don't currently have any money or oil coming in. Trump also suggested that he would, quote, take care of the situation after the U.S. operation in Iran finishes. Secretary of State Marco Rubio framed the move in human rights terms, saying the U.S. would stand for the fundamental freedoms of the Cuban people and called the island nation's leadership illegitimate.
That's Ira Spitzer. Mostly sunny today in the San Francisco Bay Area, highs in the 80s, lows tonight in the 50s. In the Central Valley, sunny, highs in the 90s, lows tonight in the 60s. Those are the headlines. I'm Max Pringle on KPFA.
Welcome back. We are back. This is A Rude Awakening. I'm Sabrina Jacobs. For years, feral, unbranded cattle in the Gila Wilderness of New Mexico, the world's first wilderness area, had been decimating critical habitat for endangered species, including Mexican spotted owls, southwestern willow flycatchers, narrow-headed garter snakes, and Gila chub, as well as loach minnow and spike dace. The feral cows were unowned and unbranded and had been reproducing independently of any ranching operation. They charged hikers and threatened public safety. No ranches or active grazing allotments were located near areas where the cattle were found. So in December, the Center for Biological Diversity intervened to support the Forest Service in the industry's lawsuit seeking to block the Gila National Forest cow removal plan. And the case reached the 10th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals after a district court upheld the plan in January, which brings us to this week, where a federal appeals court dismissed a lawsuit by the New Mexico Cattle Growers Association that challenged the U.S. Forest Service's removal of illegal feral cattle from endangered species habitat in the Gila Wilderness. All right, and here to talk about it is Todd Schulke, and Todd is the co-founder of Center for Biological Diversity. Welcome to A Rude Awakening, Todd. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. So how did the cows get there, Todd? My goodness. I mean, they didn't just pop up by themselves and start reproducing. How did they get over to the Gila Wilderness?
So there was a ranch operating on the National Forest and Wilderness land for quite a long time. And this was like back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And at some point, there were problems with the management of the ranch, in part related to the river and the endangered species on it. And the Forest Service essentially closed that permit, that allotment down. Uh, but the rancher didn't get their cows off the land. And so they were out there just running free and essentially became sort of a wild population of cattle that had never really been handled by humans. And so it was kind of a unique situation.
So yeah, we're looking at all of this area. I mean, how big was the area that they were converging upon? Because I mean, we're talking. We've got the spiked ace, that's a fish. The loach minnow, another fish, and we got willow flycatchers. What exactly were they doing to that particular um, part of the Gila Wilderness or the Gila Wilderness? Were they
Yeah,
just? Sorry, go ahead. Mhm.
so the feral cattle were in a very, very remote, isolated area, and it was people have at some point were started calling these cattle the Gila cattle and talking about the whole wilderness area, but there really was a smaller part of the wilderness around the Gila River itself um, uh, that was really being impacted by the cattle. And so it was a fairly discrete population, again, of these unique wild cattle. Uh, and there wasn't much, really no sort of interbreeding between the feral cattle and cattle from outside the area. And as you said, there aren't any active allotments or ranching operations in the vicinity of this discrete area near the river. It is a very remote spot.
Okay. And so they were just eating all the grass.
Yeah,
How are they pushing? How are they pushing that natural habitat of the Gila Wilderness? How are they pushing them out or
it,
killing them?
it was actually shocking to see
Hmm.
the estimates that there were around 200, maybe as many as 250 cattle. Um, I don't remember the exact number that came off, uh, but they were, yeah, essentially just eating all the plants that are close to the ground. Obviously, they can't eat the trees. You probably saw that picture in the press release. That's this gorgeous
Hmm.
forest, riverside forest. But what's really critical in that picture is the grasses and different plants that were growing right down to the edge of the river. And when the cattle were down there, those plants were being completely destroyed. And it looked like a moonscape across most of the that stretch of the river. And as somebody who cares about both the riparian forest, the riverside forest, and the species that depend on it, it was just a terrible thing to see.
My goodness. Yeah, I can only imagine. So, what does that mean? That, okay, so this Court of Appeals, everything went through. This is a moment to celebrate. What does that mean for those feral the feral cows? What are they gonna do with them?
Well, it turns out that most, if not all, of the feral cattle were removed by this program, and that's part of the reason why the appeals court. It actually was a an appeal of a decision at a lower court in New Mexico that was rejected by the appeals court, and they had a judge rule against them multiple times. In fact, at one point, it was almost as if he found the whole thing amusing, because it was the arguments that the cattle growers were making were so ridiculous. Um,
Hmm.
but the the judge made the right decision and allowed the lethal removal to go forward, as well as there were roundups happening at the same time. So it was a multi-pronged approach to get rid of the feral cattle. And uh, again, referring back to that photograph, of which we have hundreds, the recovery was amazing. And it's only been, I think the last time the helicopters flew was in 2023. I don't remember exactly when the Roundup contract ended. It was after that. But they were successful in removing uh, around 200 or more cattle from the area, and that's allowed the habitat to recover.
Right, right. So the livestock industry slaughtered 5,900 cattle in New Mexico last year. So, wow, that's
Yeah,
that's. Mhm,
the
go ahead.
point
Sorry.
we were making with that is that, you know, people were upset about this. It was, and you know, it's not something that we enjoyed making happen. Or helping make happen. It was an upsetting thing. Partly, uh, you know, just shooting any animal is a shocking thing in its own right. But it's also a wilderness area, so it was again a unique situation that required sort of drastic measures to save to protect the habitat and set the conditions so that the habitat would be restored. So we didn't take this decision lightly to support the effort by the Forest Service. But many of the cattle were also rounded up and taken out. But the end goal for these cattle would be slaughter, and that was the point of quoting how many cattle were slaughtered in one year in New Mexico. These cattle were going to be rounded up and taken to the sale barn and probably turned into hamburger because they were heavily muscled wild animals. They're not the kind of, you know, cattle that produce the fine steaks that some people love. So, ultimately, uh, these cattle were doomed one way or another. And so we felt like it was worth supporting the Forest Service decision to remove them both with roundups and lethally. And after seeing the response to the removal of the cattle on the ground, the response on the ground, it certainly seemed like a good trade-off.
Indeed, a good trade-off. 5,000 public comments in support of removing the feral cattle from the wilderness, from the Gila National Forest. Yeah.
Yeah, the public response was overwhelming. It's you can get more comments than that on a project, but for something fairly discrete and limited in landscape and things like that, that was a huge number of members of the public that stepped up and said, we support this, even though people were uncomfortable with the lethal part.
Yeah, well, I mean, the end result is would have been the same for them. I think folks need to take
Yeah.
stock of that because that is the fact right there. And let's just go over the animals, the fish, the owls, the willow flycatchers, the southwestern willow flycatchers. Let's talk about them. They're the ones that are going to be able to come back in mass and populate that area naturally. The Gila chub, the loach minnow, the spike days, Mexican spotted owls, southwestern willow flycatchers, and the narrow-headed garter snakes. So they're able.
Yeah, these are animals that are
Mhm.
really at the brink of extinction, and particularly the fish, and also the narrow-headed garter snake. These are animals that depend on clean water. The stream side vegetation helps filter out sediment and to keep the water clean. It's a system that works really well to provide the best habitat possible for these species. And there's something about the Gila. It's so remote that we still have these species left. They're hanging on by their proverbial fingernails, but they are hanging on, albeit in low numbers. And so it's a kind of place where you don't often have lists like that include so many endangered species. Maybe you have one or two, but this is a place where a lot of the original species still persist, and in that sense, it adds sort of adds to the need for protection and in this case restoration.
Indeed. All right. Well, hey, we celebrate this win with you here at A Rude Awakening. Todd Schulke, thank you so, so much. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close out?
I don't think so. I think that was good.
All right. Todd Schulke, co-founder of Center for Biological Diversity. Truly appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Welcome back. We are back. This is A Rude Awakening. I'm Sabrina Jacobs. War all over this globe. We have, of course, the Iran war. We've got the ongoing war in the Gaza Strip. Lebanon now. We have the Sudan. We have Ukraine. Smaller wars in the Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo, etc., etc. So what is the cost of war on the environment? What is the cost of the ecocide being waged on this planet? Here to talk about that is Dr. Leslie Joseph. And Dr. Leslie Joseph is an associate professor of civil engineering at Liberty University. His expertise is in environmental engineering, environmental stewardship, and environmental justice and ethics. And he has published on the topics of war impacts on the environment. Dr. Leslie Joseph, welcome to A Rude Awakening.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here with you.
All right. So this is it's getting scarier and scarier. There's more wars that are happening. It's kind of a ebb and flow. I don't know, as long as I've been on this planet, of war, just all over the world. So talk to us about the cost of war on the environment, namely the war that's happening in Iran, around Iran, what they're doing, what's being done to them, the Strait of Hormuz. Talk to us about the cost.
Yeah, no problem. So it's important to recognize that war in and of itself will cause environmental damage, environmental harm. It will cause environmental harm. I think what's interesting in these more recent conflicts and more recent wars is that we're seeing these environmental impacts really increase at levels we haven't seen in the past. And we're seeing actors in these wars specifically target environmental infrastructure, aspects of people's environments that they rely on for their well-being, and a continued attempt to really decimate the environments in these areas. And so if we're thinking, for instance, about the war in Iran, we can talk about how a lot of the airstrikes and a lot of the bombardments have been occurring at oil and gas facilities, at places where Iran generates its wealth and its income and its revenues. And those industries are very polluting in and of themselves. So when you actually attack them, you're releasing those toxic chemicals, those fumes into the air. You're seeing oil spills into the water, onto the land, and you're seeing these chemicals really migrate across large parts of the country and contaminate the environments around them. And so as a result, there have been reports of acid rain coming down in Iran after some of these strikes have destroyed oil depots, and that smoke went into the air and it rained back down on the people that live there.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a lot of discussion about the water contamination in, for instance, the Strait of Hormuz, in the Dead Sea, in those areas where there's a lot of fighting taking place, a lot of artillery exchanges. There's landmines that Iran's placing in the strait to try to prevent traffic. And so it renders those parts of the strait and those parts of the waters unusable and essentially off limits to whoever's interested in either passing through or using that for their own purposes. And so we can see throughout these wars, throughout these conflicts, tremendous environmental damage, tremendous environmental impact, and tremendous harm to people who live in those areas where the environment's being so impacted. And so I think it's important to recognize that all of these impacts are a part of the cost of these wars and of these conflicts, and they should not be ignored when we discuss the true nature of what war brings to a country or to a people.
Mm-hmm. Most definitely, most definitely. So, there's actually an article that you wrote. I mean, it's almost a year old in the Newsline magazine, but it's still very important right now at this moment. It was specifically about the war in Gaza, and you discuss how the impacts of what has happened there, the refugee camps, the contamination of water. But talk to us a little bit more about it. Let me just give the title of that article to everybody that is listening. The toxic blowback of Israel's bombs, how military action in Gaza is polluting the land, air, and water far beyond the enclave's bounds. So that's, let's see, from the 29th of July, 2025, New Lines Magazine. I'll have the link on the show description page for A Rude Awakening at kpfa.org. So, Dr. Leslie Joseph, talk to us about, let's drill down a little bit more.
Yeah, let's keep talking about it. Let's keep talking about it. So I think what's important to recognize in that particular conflict and more broadly with war in general and environmental pollution in general is that it does not stay wherever you think the war is occurring. And so the thrust of that piece that I wrote for New Lines Magazine really highlighted the fact that the environmental impacts of Israel's war on Gaza weren't going to stay in Gaza. It was going to impact Israel as well. The air pollution that they were seeing, the air travels, and people on the border of Israel and Gaza are seeing impacts to their air quality. They're seeing toxic chemicals and fumes migrating across the border into their country. We're looking at things like the pollution that's moving into the Mediterranean Sea from untreated sewage because the wastewater treatment plants in Gaza are destroyed or they are deprived of electricity to run and operate. That Mediterranean Sea is a water source for various countries along that coast, not just the Gaza Strip. And so when that gets polluted, those impacts also affect other people beyond Gaza itself. And when we think about the idea of generating all of this toxic waste and rubble and debris from the bombings and the destruction of homes and schools and hospitals and other medical facilities and other civilian infrastructure that's occurring during this war that's being waged, all of that waste has to go somewhere. Someone's going to have to remove that waste from the Gaza Strip in order to rebuild and to reconstitute that society. Where is that waste going? Who's going to remove it? Where's it going to be placed? Those kinds of impacts will undoubtedly affect more than just the people who live in Gaza. And so when I think about that war in particular and the way that's being waged and the sheer levels of destruction that are taking place on its environment, that article really wants to highlight that those impacts will not remain in Gaza alone. And those impacts include, like I said, air pollution, water pollution, groundwater pollution. The aquifers are being polluted as well. The land, the soil, the infrastructure has toxins in it. A lot of the buildings are old. There's asbestos there. Lead paint that gets dispersed and, pressed into the environment once those buildings are destroyed. Particulate matter and dust. And when you think about the human cost, the human health impacts, those also don't stay there either as people contract different infectious diseases, different waterborne diseases from having a lack of clean water and sanitation service, a lack of medical care and facilities to get their injuries treated and their wounds treated and their sicknesses dealt with. We have to remember, before the war, these hospitals were treating people who were sick, people who needed medical attention. You add to that the calamities that are coming from this war, and now you have a healthcare crisis that will not stay. The refugee camps, there's disease spreading throughout them. As people leave the Strip and try to find safe havens and safe passage, they're taking those illnesses with them and looking for treatment. And so all of these impacts from the war will not remain in the Gaza Strip. And all these impacts are becoming more and more common throughout the world as these wars are being waged. And so we have to really consider that and think about that, because even though we may believe that it's unfortunate that certain areas are being, destroyed and the environment is being decimated in these ways, it will not remain in those particular areas. It will spread, and we will have to reckon with it in one way or another.
Absolutely. Very well put. Yeah, so Dr. Joseph, and the second, no, is it the second? Yeah, the second paragraph from your article in New Lines magazine, you lay it out. Again, the toxic blowback of Israel's bombs from the 29th of July, 2025. Dr. Leslie Joseph, you write, and might be a little bit redundant. We're just going to repeat it again here. Chemicals released or created by bombs that will increase chances of birth defects, cancer, respiratory problems, and heart disease are spreading through the air, water, and soil. Given the way these substances travel, their effects will be felt far beyond Gaza, just like you said. Perchlorates will travel to Israel in the water supply, blocking the thyroids of citizens and leading to birth defects and fertility issues. Untreated sewage, just like you said, will spread through the Mediterranean, reaching countries along the coast, including Lebanon and Syria, poisoning drinking water supplies. Particulates in the air will be blown into Israel and Egypt, leading to increased respiratory illness and heart disease for anyone in their path. And the carbon released is in large enough quantities to measurably increase climate change, affecting every person on the planet. Wow, absolutely devastating consequences we are heading for. It seems with all of these so-called victories from one side or the other, they're not victories at all. Do you see the end of our planet coming sooner than later, Dr. Leslie Joseph?
Well, with what's interesting is when we think about the kind of global climate impacts of war, they often far exceed the types of industries that we think about when we think about air pollution and climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And even when you think about the infrastructure that continues to produce the wars that we're seeing, all of that is damaging the environment, all of it. And so I do think that if we do not find more diplomatic, more political solutions, more, approaches to dealing with conflict that don't involve war, we will push ourselves further and further toward a reality where the world and the earth and the resources become scarce, the air becomes unbreathable, and we create an environment that is uninhabitable for those of us who rely on it, which is every single person. And so when we think about that, I do think that we have to be mindful of that reality, right? And for me, as someone who does a lot of environmental justice, I do like to center the more vulnerable populations and communities that get the brunt of that first, who don't have the resources to insulate themselves from those impacts directly. So, for instance, in these wars, there's a tremendous increase in greenhouse gas emissions. There's an increase in pollution. There's a decrease in the availability of resources that we need to sustain ourselves, right? The land gets polluted, the resources become scarce, or they're consolidated by the conquering, factions or the corporations who seize control of certain areas. And so what ends up happening is that there's less to go around, and there are few people in control of those resources. And so those of us who are vulnerable, those of us who are on the margins, it's not available. And so now we have issues. We have issues paying for our food because the prices are sky high. We have issues with fuel to be able to travel, go to work, visit family, do things that normal people do. We can't do that anymore because the resources are so scarce. We find ourselves having to come up with other technological advances to try to blunt the impacts that we are having on the climate and the environment. And it becomes this very toxic cycle that we just cannot get ourselves out of until we break the cycle, come out of it, and think of other ways to deal with conflict.
Mhm.
And that goes even beyond the direct engagement with other countries in terms of war. We have to also consider the ways in which the military industrial complex as a whole contributes to climate change and contributes to the degradation of our environments. And so there have been numerous studies that talk about things like PFAS, the forever chemicals, and heavy metals being in the soils and in the air around military bases. And there's a lot of discussion about how energy intensive these installations are in terms of consuming fuel for large vehicles, for operations, and for maintenance. And so just the infrastructure itself that we maintain in order to be able to conduct war in and of itself is polluting and harmful and devastating to the environment. And so all of that has to be taken into consideration if we're serious about reducing the kind of impact we want to have on the environment as a whole. You know, we have, we talk a lot about fossil fuel industries and we want to move to renewable energy. We want to do different things and have a just transition to different fuel sources. But what about this ongoing kind of militarism that we continue to fund and fuel and promote and project out into the world? What impact is that having on the environment? I would argue it's a very devastating one that we need to be mindful of and somehow combat.
Exactly. Exactly. Well said. Well said. Well, and Dr. Leslie Joseph, we have just run out of time, but this is the first of many conversations. Folks, that was the voice of Dr. Leslie Joseph, and he is an associate professor of civil engineering at Liberty University. And his expertise is in environmental engineering, environmental stewardship, and environmental justice and ethics. And he has published on this topic of war impacts on the environment. Dr. Leslie Joseph, thank you so much for being on A Rude Awakening. Truly appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Welcome back. We are back. This is A Rude Awakening. I'm Sabrina Jacobs. Media Matters for America has released one of their annual reports on national environmental coverage, and 2025 was bleak. Safe to say, more so than ever before. This report is entitled How Broadcast TV News Covered Environmental Justice in 2025. And we have, once again, the author of these exhaustive and dire reports, Evlondo Cooper. Evlondo Cooper, senior writer with the Climate and Energy Program at Media Matters for America, MediaMatters.org. How are you? Welcome back.
Doing well. Thank you for having me. I always love joining you and talking to your listeners.
Yes, and definitely letting folks know what is going on or what is not happening in this case. My goodness. So I'm going to quote some of your writing here. Environmental justice is distinct from climate justice. While climate justice focuses more broadly on unequal climate impacts and equitable climate responses, this analysis uses a narrower environmental justice standard focused on the development, implementation, and enforcement of protective environmental laws, regulations, and policies, and whether environmental harms or risks disproportionately affect specific communities by race, color, national origin, or income. So environmental justice, Evlondo, in this particular report, you're starting it off with this discussion about environmental justice around climate justice. Let's talk about what the difference is between the two, because we've got environmental justice that's more on a national or local level. Talk to us, explain it more.
Yeah, we just thought it was important to include this distinction because A lot of times these ideas do blur together in readers' minds. Sometimes they blur together in mine. So it was kind of important for us to show why they are distinct. This is based on the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency's definition of environmental justice. And the way I think about it is, if a hurricane hits a poor community in southern Louisiana, their ability to respond to that, to recover from that, to even leave is climate justice. Where climate impacts are going to hurt first and worst, which communities. When it comes to environmental justice, you're thinking about more localized, human-driven decisions. So there's a new data center. Where are we going to site it? Are we going to site it in this rich community, or are we going to pick this poor rural community or this low-income Black community outside of Memphis to site this data center or this industrial plant? So environmental justice focus more on those human-driven decisions about where pollution impacts are situated, who is impacted the most, and who has the least ability to respond to those impacts.
Yeah, the AI center is supposed to be going in at was it Richland or something like that, Louisiana?
Oh yeah, it's one of many.
Mhm.
Yeah, so we thought it was important to include that context. And look, the news is bad. There were only 2 environmental justice segments aired on corporate broadcast networks in 2025. And we've seen a multi-year decline. I mean, even in its best year, it wasn't that great considering, just how pervasive environmental injustice is. I think my focus this year is on the idea that broadcast networks are already covering many of the right stories. Again, there was some coverage of Trump administration actions that have harmfully impacted the environmental space. There was coverage of the data center expansion. There's constant coverage of different explosions, impacts, industrial leaks. So they're covering the stories. What they need to do is make the reporting complete by asking just a few more basic journalistic questions. Who is exposed, why they're exposed, and what decisions are producing that exposure. And that's, the quickest way to turn a basic environmental story into an environmental justice story. And more importantly for me, as I've been thinking about this work, we have environmental justice as a niche, but the questions you ask about to determine if a story is an environmental justice story are questions reporters should be asking themselves anyway. You don't cover an industrial explosion or a leak or a data center expansion without asking why here, why there, who is going to be harmed, who's driving. To me, it's just a basic reporting framework that just so happens to expose environmental injustice in the process.
Okay. Definitely. Now, and to follow up with that question, that very important question, who is impacted and why? That's one of the topics in the report.
Yes.
Ask who is impacted and why. What is the incentive for reporters, journalists out there to do so?
That's a good question. I mean, to me, journalism is a job like any other, right? And so if you have a tight deadline, if you have limited resources, you make the deadline and say you need to go do the story about this explosion, and we need to get it out in the next few hours. I think my approach is what's in it for them is you can still honor your kind of deadline-driven environment in the journalistic space, but you can also ask just a few more questions that make the reporting more fuller and more useful to the local community, to your readers or watchers or listeners. And I think anybody that goes into the journalistic field, to some extent, wants to uncover the truth. They want to find out. They have a natural curiosity about what's going on. And I think for whatever reason, these stories are kind of in the blind side of many, even well-meaning journalists. And so I think part of it is yes, we understand the realities of this kind of quick turnaround, content-driven media environment we're in. All we're saying is just a few more applying a little bit of a lens to the stories you're already doing can make it a much better, much more fulfilling, much more substantive story and actually drive important outcomes, especially in local communities. I think the media is again behind on a data center story. I think what you're seeing now is the media finally catching up to like local opposition is stopping a lot of these centers from being built. And I think as the media reports on that, it's emboldening more communities to take steps to prevent these centers from being built there, from being built in vulnerable communities. And you're even seeing new coalitions of groups forming, whether it's impacted communities, vulnerable communities, even some NIMBYs, who are demanding more accountability about how these data centers are being built, where and why. And so I think the reporting can actually drive some of these important changes that we want to see in society.
Yeah, exactly. I don't understand how they do not, a lot of corporate media does not ask those questions, those pertinent questions. Ask who it's impacting. It's like it's negligence. It's negligence in
It
doing
is.
journalism and providing, well thought out, well researched, pure journalism. But that's exactly, you don't have a lot of folks that are in it to ask those questions. You don't have folks that are naturally drawn to it. You have there's a lot of performative presentations, I guess you could say, as far as corporate media is concerned and how they're delivering. But now let's talk about how we'll drill down on PBS here. Let's talk about how PBS covered environmental justice. It's another one of the topics in your report.
Yeah, I gotta say, PBS aired 3 segments in 2025. Um, which is more than the broadcast networks, the corporate broadcast networks. But I mean, yeah, it's 3. And PBS typically, especially on climate coverage, it's able to dive deeper and do more substantive reporting that the broadcast networks don't do. But yeah, it was a bad year for environmental justice coverage overall. I mean, it's not to say that PBS didn't have some terrific environmental segments, but to me, those were often just as frustrating, if not more so, because those segments come so close to like asking that one extra question that provides much more context and unlocks a deeper level of reporting. So yeah, PBS, they did a slightly better job than the corporate broadcast networks, but we've seen just a general retrenchment overall and coverage of environmental justice. And I think in this environment where you have the Trump administration again waging an active assault against environmental and climate legislation and policy, and we know who is going to impact first and worst. I mean, they made a big show out of closing down the EPA's environmental justice offices. I think it's almost. I think any context on Trump administration actions with regard to the EPA or other environmental issues has to include context about who is going to be hurt first and worst. So, and I think that's one of the most impactful stories that, if you're focused on what all the horrible things the Trump administration is doing, to me, I don't see how you can exclude these actions in particular.
Wow, I'm surprised that PBS didn't do their due diligence. Would you categorize it as such, that they didn't do their due diligence?
Again, I think if and this is just anecdotally because there's I don't have any data for this, but like watching all the segments, they did even better environmental coverage overall. So I can say that, like anecdotally, PBS's environmental coverage was deeper and more substantive than what the corporate broadcast networks produced, even at the basic level of environmental coverage. But yes, when it comes to environmental justice coverage, do you apply that framework? Do you ask those expert questions that turn an environmental story into an environmental justice story? No, they didn't do much better than the broadcast networks did on this issue.
I'm floored. I am floored. Wow, 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 wow. So this study This report, again, it is entitled How Broadcast TV News Covered Environmental Justice in 2025. This report, it goes out to these folks. It goes out to corporate media and PBS as well, and hopefully they are reading it. And you can take a look at it too at mediamatters.org, mediamatters.org, and the link, along with other pertinent links, will be on the show description page for A Rude Awakening at kpfa.org. Now let's move on to your methodology. How does Evlondo Cooper get it done? How do you do it? I mean, it's a lot of information. It's a lot of data collection. It's a lot of crunching of numbers. Talk to us about your process.
Yeah, you can find a very detailed description of methodology at the end of the study, but I mean, really, it's just we use tools that we have. One of them is the Kinetic database, and we've developed a search string that's pretty exhaustive. It covers, it's not just environmental justice. What we do is we look for almost total environmental coverage, whether it's pollution, air pollution, particulate matter. I watch those segments, I review those transcripts, and I look for any connection between that story, whether it's a pollution, air pollution, fossil fuel pollution, health hazard, and whether or not they connected to an EPA identified marginalized community, whether that's a low income community, a community of color, an indigenous community. So yeah, I look at the universe of environmental coverage and review those stories to see if they take that extra step to turn that environmental story into an environmental justice story.
Mm-hmm. And sadly, just for the most part, it's not the case. Mm-hmm.
But I think, we you've had me on a lot, and we have these conversations where we do, it is dire. It's dire across the board. I think my silver lining this year is, just realizing, and in past studies, I've been able to talk to environmental justice beat reporters and print reporters and digital reporters. And the sense that I have is, this problem is very fixable. We're not calling for every segment to be a documentary, or everything to be an exhaustive 10-month investigation, but we need much more of that kind of reporting too, right? Mm-hmm. What we're saying is just ask the one extra question. If you are covering a story, like a big story last year that received a lot of coverage was this explosion at the Chevron's El Segundo refinery in October. There were multiple segments about that explosion. It was a big deal, and it really affected the neighboring community. But to turn that, environmental story into an environmental justice story, you need to ask, okay, why was this facility sited here? What is the demographic of the people who are impacted by the explosion? And it doesn't require, again, it doesn't require like a feature-length documentary, but it can add a little bit more context to say, hey, this facility was sited here, X. It was cited here when these folks lived here, and these folks are the ones bearing the brunt of not just this explosion, but the pollution that the plant's emitting, So I think what I'm taking away is I'm going to push the idea that, you can broadcast networks, print journalists, outlets can immediately improve their environmental reporting by just asking a few extra questions that give the stories a little bit more substance, a little more context, and could actually unlock new stories, and also give the people the information and power they need to demand accountability for how these decisions are impacting their lives, which a lot of times they have no say-so in anyway. But I take comfort from what we've seen with the data centers, because we do see that if citizens are concerned enough and are organized enough, they can win some important victories. And so I would love to see this take root across a broad variety of issues, whether it's siting from industrial facilities. Louisiana's been dealing with Cancer Alley for decades at this point. I just think there are a lot of places in this country where poor, low-income communities of color have been silently dealing with the harm of these fossil fuel infrastructure, these chemical industries. And I would love to see reporting that galvanizes them as well and galvanizes the country to take action on their behalf. And I think the data center coverage is a good model for that. And I would just love to see that amplified and replicated on corporate broadcast media and cable TV news as well.
Yeah, the little bit that's happening, the trickling down or trickling over, it's not enough. It's definitely not enough.
No.
It's testament to how corporate media has taken a side, and it's definitely not the side of the people. Evlondo Cooper, got a few more minutes. Anything else?
I do.
Okay. What was it? I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, I'm happy to stay as long, but I mean, that's, I just, if I had to leave with, it was what I said before. It's dire. These stories are more important than ever, but we're dealing with an administration that has dedicated itself to unraveling even the most basic environmental and climate protections for all of us. But of course, they're going to impact vulnerable communities worse. And so I think now is the time more than ever that we actually need impactful reporting that's willing to ask a few more questions. And again, provide people with the information they need to demand accountability and take action.
All right, there you have it, folks. That was the voice of Evlondo Cooper, senior writer with the Climate and Energy Program at Media Matters for America, MediaMatters.org. And his latest report on their website is entitled How Broadcast TV News Covered Environmental Justice in 2025. Evlondo Cooper, thank you so much for being on A Rude Awakening once again.
Thank you for having me.
All pertinent links are on the show description page for A Rude Awakening at kpfa.org. And that does it for another edition of A Rude Awakening. I'm Sabrina Jacobs. A big thank you to my guests, Todd Schulke, Dr. Leslie Joseph, and Evlondo Cooper for taking the time. Kirsten is on the controls. The music on today's show is Life Is What You Make It by Talk Talk and Listen to Me by Baby Huey. I'll be back next week, same time, same place. Stay tuned for a rebroadcast of Democracy Now! Coming up next. And remember, good people, embrace each other as we embrace the mother of us all. Thank you for listening.
American historian Manisha Sinha.
One could imagine the permanent achievement of interracial democracy and Black citizenship in this country. And if we had had that, you could really think about the republic that we had after the civil rights movement as having taken place 100 years prior. So it would have been a tremendous success for American democracy if indeed we had been able to preserve the results of the Civil War and create a society in the South that was more just towards people of African descent. We still live with the long afterlives of slavery and racism in this country, and one of the reasons why we do that is precisely because Reconstruction was overthrown in a brutal manner.
Get Learned, only on KPFA.
From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We have proved once and for all that there is no such thing as progressive except for Palestine. I will fight for health care, not bombs. To abolish ICE. And to unrig this economy once and for all.
A former U.S. Army surgeon who volunteered in Gaza is one step closer to winning a seat in Congress representing New Jersey. We'll speak to Dr. Adam Hamawi, who won the Democratic primary on Tuesday. He's also known for saving the life of U.S. Senator Tammy